Sarah Chun sat in the back row of the Zen Archaeology lecture hall and felt the weight of her 3 centuries pressing down on her augmented shoulders. She had taken this class on a whim, wanting to understand how the younger species of the galaxy viewed ancient history. And now she wondered if that had been a mistake. The professor stood at the front of the room, a tall Valkyrian whose crystalline skin caught the lights and scattered them into rainbow patterns across the walls. His voice was calm and measured as he began his presentation on what he called Lost Civilizations of the Third Arm. Case study of species 347 Theta. Sarah shifted in her seat and tried to pay attention, though part of her mind was already thinking about dinner and whether the campus cafeteria would have anything close to human food. The Valkyrian continued speaking, explaining that species 347 Theta had arisen approximately 12,000 galactic standard years ago on a small blue world they had called Earther. Attention snapped back to the lecture at the mention of that name Earth, and she felt something cold slide down her spine. The professor was saying that this species had been remarkable for their explosive development, achieving nuclear fission and digital computation and early genetic manipulation within just a single rotation around their star. The screen behind the professor filled with images. Buildings that looked primitive by galactic standards. Vehicles with wheels instead of gravity drives. Cultural artifacts that the Valkyrian described as quaint and endearing in their simplicity. Sarah found her hands gripping the edges of her desk. As recognition began to dawn, she knew those buildings. She had walked past them every day for 4 years. The professor continued his lecture, explaining that species 347 Theta had shown great promise, but had ultimately suffered complete extinction during what he called the Cascade Event, a premature stellar death that had occurred approximately 11,847 years ago. The galaxy had mourned briefly, he noted, but this primitive species had left little mark beyond some radio signals and a few archaeological sites. Sarah's heart pounded against her reinforced ribcage, the augmented muscle working overtime as adrenaline flooded her system. She told herself to stay calm, to breathe, to not draw attention. But then, the professor clicked to the next image and her world tilted. This is an example of what we believe was an educational ceremonial gathering from the species' final era, the Valkyrian said, gesturing at the projection with one crystalline hand. Note the primitive fabric garments and the curious head coverings that appear to have served no protective function. We theorize these were purely symbolic. Sarah stared at the image and felt reality fracturing around her. She knew that brick building behind the crowd of students. It was the main quad at MIT. She knew those oak trees that lined the pathways. She knew that impossibly blue sky that spoke of a summer day in New England. And there, third row from the bottom, wearing a mortarboard hat and grinning like she owned the universe, was her Sarah Chen, class of 2047, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering. Her vision blurred, and she realized she was crying. She hadn't cried in over a century, had thought that particular human response had been bred out of her by time and augmentation and loss. But here she was, tears streaming down her face as she stared at herself from 12,000 years ago. The professor was still talking, explaining how unfortunate it was that such a promising species had been cut down in their prime. He spoke about the stellar dynamics that had led to their son's premature death, about the archaeological evidence recovered from the planet's ruins, about how species 347 Theta had been on the verge of becoming a spacefaring civilization when tragedy struck. Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and tell them they were wrong, that humanity hadn't died, that she was sitting right here in this lecture hall, alive and breathing and very much not extinct. But how could she explain that? How could she make them understand? Her hand rose before she could stop it, trembling in the air like a leaf in a storm. The professor paused mid-sentence and looked toward the back of the room, his crystalline face refracting the light into patterns that indicated curiosity. "Yes, student Chun?" he said, using the false name she had registered under. "Do you have a question about the presentation?" Sarah stood slowly, her legs shaking beneath her. Every eye in the lecture hall turned toward her crystalline Valkyrian eyes. Compound Thrixian eyes, the sensor clusters of the Mercury students. All focused on her with various degrees of interest. Her voice came out rough and cracked, rusty from centuries of carefully modulating it to sound less human. "Excuse me, Professor." She paused, swallowed hard, tried again. "Why are you showing my graduation photo?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient hum of the climate control system seemed to fade away as 300 students and one professor processed what she had just said. The Valkyrian skin shifted through several colors, blue to orange to a sickly green that Sarah had learned indicated confusion and disbelief. "I'm sorry, student Chun, but I don't understand your question." This image was recovered from authenticated archaeological data from the ruins of Earth. Carbon dated to 11,847 galactic standard years ago. Sarah walked down the aisle toward the projection, each step feeling like she was walking through molasses. She reached the front of the hall and pointed at the image with a shaking finger. "That's me," she said, her voice growing stronger now that she had committed to this path. "Third row from the bottom, 5 people from the left. I'm wearing the blue dress because my roommate convinced me it would look better in photos than the traditional black gown." She pointed to another figure in the image. "That's Marcus Chun, no relation, and he has a coffee stain on his gown that he got that morning rushing to the ceremony. He was panicking because he thought he'd lost his thesis until I reminded him he'd already submitted it 2 weeks earlier." The professor's colors were shifting rapidly now, cycling through his species' entire emotional spectrum. "Student Chun, this must be some kind of mistake. Perhaps you've seen this image in a historical database and constructed false memories." Jenny Nakamura wrote "Weinstein sucks" on the inside of her cap as a joke about our quantum mechanics professor. Sarah continued, ignoring him. "It rained an hour after this photo was taken, and everyone's carefully styled hair got ruined. We all went to this terrible pizza place called Antonio's afterward, and I got food poisoning from the pepperoni." She turned to face the class. And in that moment, she made the decision that would change everything. Her hand went to the neural interface band wrapped around her temples, the device that had been masking her true biometric signature for the past 70 years, and she pulled it off. The lecture hall's security systems immediately began to alarm. The AI voice that managed campus safety protocols spoke in urgent tones. "Alert. Unknown biological entity detected. Genetic markers indicate origin from extinct species 347 Theta. Impossibility noted. Requesting immediate quarantine protocols and authorization for academic study." Sarah stood at the front of the hall, her neural interface band dangling from her hand, and looked at the sea of shocked faces staring back at her. She was tired, so incredibly tired of running, of hiding, of pretending to be something other than what she was. "My name is Sarah Chun," she said clearly. "I was born in San Francisco, California, on planet Earth, in the year 2025. I graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2047 with a degree in aerospace engineering. 1 year later, I volunteered for the Genesis Project, humanity's first interstellar colonization attempt. The alarms were still blaring, but everyone was frozen, listening. The Valkyrian professor had stopped cycling through colors and was simply staring at her with what she recognized as wonder. Something went wrong with our ship. Sarah continued. We were supposed to sleep for 10 years, but when my pod malfunctioned and woke me up, I found myself alone on a failing vessel thousands of years in the future. The other 9,999 humans aboard were dead. I was rescued by a Valkyrian merchant ship, and I've been moving through the galaxy ever since. Learning that my world was supposedly destroyed and my species was extinct. She looked directly at the professor. So I'll ask you again. Professor, why are you showing my graduation photo? And why does your historical record say that humanity is extinct when I'm standing right here? The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before campus security burst through the doors, weapons drawn. Sarah raised her hand slowly, surrendering without resistance as they led her away. She heard the whispers starting, spreading through the lecture hall like wildfire. By the time they reached the security office, her story was already racing across the campus network. Sarah Chun, the impossible survivor, the last human, the living ghost of an extinct species. She had spent 300 years hiding her true nature, and now, in the space of 5 minutes, she had revealed herself to the galaxy. The question that burned in her mind as they processed her and contacted the university administration and called for xenobiological specialists was simple. If she was here, if she had survived, then what really happened to humanity? Why did the galaxy believe her species was dead? The next 6 hours passed in a blur of medical scans, biometric analyses, and increasingly frantic conversations between university officials, who seemed unable to decide whether Sarah was a historic discovery or a potential biological hazard. She sat in a sterile examination room and submitted to test after test. Her patience wearing thin but her resolve firm. She had made her choice, and there was no going back now. The Valkyrian professor whose lecture she had interrupted stood on the other side of a transparent barrier, watching as xenobiologists took samples of her hair, her skin, her blood. His crystalline face had settled into a pattern of blues and purples that indicated deep fascination mixed with academic excitement. The genetic markers are undeniable. One of the xenobiologists, a small, furry creature called a Paxian, was saying to a cluster of officials, "Her DNA contains the exact base pairs described in the recovered archaeological samples from Earth. Her cellular structure shows longevity treatments that match theoretical models we've developed from studying Species 347 Data's medical databases." Sarah closed her eyes and tried not to think about the word sample and how many times she had heard it in the past few hours. She was not a specimen, not a curiosity to be dissected and catalogued. But she understood their shock after all. She was supposed to be extinct. The university's chancellor, a dignified Threnian who existed partially in gaseous form, floated into the examination room and spoke in harmonics that the translation device rendered as, "Dr. Chun, we owe you an apology for the invasive nature of these procedures. However, you must understand that your revelation has created something of a crisis. The entire foundation of our historical understanding of your species has been called into question." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at the Chancellor. "I understand that, Chancellor. What I don't understand is why your records say that Earth's sun underwent premature stellar death. That's not something that happens randomly. Stars follow predictable life cycles." The Chancellor's gaseous form rippled in what Sarah had learned was the Threnian equivalent of a thoughtful nod. "That is precisely what our astrophysics department has been urgently investigating for the past 3 hours. I believe they have some preliminary findings that you should hear." They moved Sarah to a conference room where a dozen academics had gathered, their faces or equivalent expressing various degrees of excitement and confusion. The Valkyrian professor was there, and he stood when Sarah entered, his colors shifting to warm oranges that indicated respect. "Dr. Chun," he said, using her proper title now, "I apologize for my earlier dismissal of your claims. It appears that I, along with every other xenarchaeologist in the galaxy, have been operating under false information. A holographic star chart appeared in the center of the conference table, showing Earth's solar system as it supposedly existed 12,000 years ago. Another Valkyrian, this one wearing the insignia of the astrophysics department, manipulated the display with graceful movements of her crystalline hands. We've analyzed current stellar data from Earth's sun, the astrophysicist explained. It is a perfectly healthy main sequence star that shows no signs of instability, past or present. Based on its current composition and burn rate, it should continue fusion reactions for approximately another 5 billion standard years. Sarah leaned forward, her enhanced mind racing through the implications. So the historical records were falsified. It appears so, the astrophysicist confirmed. Moreover, when we examined the provenance of those records, we discovered something disturbing. They all trace back to a single source: the Krell merchant hegemony's historical archives. Approximately 11,600 years ago, the name meant nothing to Sarah, but she saw several of the academics' exchange glances that suggested it meant something to them. The Valkyrian professor explained. The Krell were a dominant economic power during that era. They controlled most of the galactic trade routes and had significant influence over the Galactic Council. Were? Sarah asked. What happened to them? They collapsed about 8,000 years ago, the Chancellor said. Their hegemony became too rigid, too controlling. Member species began breaking away, forming independent trade coalitions. Within a few centuries, the Krell went from galactic powerhouse to a minor regional player. Sarah's mind was working through the puzzle pieces, trying to fit them together, so the Krell falsified records about humanity's extinction. The question is why? What did they gain from making the galaxy believe we were dead? The room fell silent as everyone considered this. Finally, a small voice spoke up from the corner. It belonged to a Thrixian historian whose compound eyes gleamed with excitement. I may have found something relevant. I'd been searching through old Krell economic archives, and I discovered a classified document from 11,612 years ago. The historian projected the document, which appeared in several galactic languages. Sarah's translation implant rendered it into English. Risk assessment. Species 347 Theta. Common name: humans. Threat level: critical. Recommendation: economic and political suppression required. Sarah read the document with growing anger. It described humanity as dangerously innovative and prone to disrupting established economic models. It noted that human psychology favored what it called creative destruction, the constant upending of existing systems in favor of new approaches. They were afraid of us, Sarah said quietly. The Krell were afraid that if humanity joined the galactic community, we would disrupt their economic control. The Valkyrian professor's colors shifted to dark reds. It appears so. And they went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that humanity never became a threat. But Sarah was shaking her head. Something else occurring to her. No, wait. If the Krell just wanted to suppress humanity, they could have done that through economic sanctions or political pressure. Why go to the trouble of faking our complete extinction? That's an enormous undertaking, falsifying stellar death records, creating fake archaeological evidence. The room went quiet again as they all realized what Sarah was suggesting. The Chancellor's gaseous form contracted tightly. You believe humanity wasn't destroyed at all? I think humanity left, Sarah said, her heart beginning to race. I think we saw what the Krell were trying to do, and we chose to leave the galactic community entirely. And the Krell, unable to accept that a species would refuse their control, decided to make sure no one ever looked for us. The Valkyrian professor was cycling through colors rapidly. That would explain the meticulous nature of the cover-up. They weren't just hiding a tragedy. They were hiding an act of defiance. If other species learned that humans had successfully rejected Krell hegemony and survived, It might have inspired others to do the same. Sarah stood and paced the conference room, her 3 centuries of life suddenly seeming insufficient for the weight of this revelation. When I was rescued by that merchant ship 300 years ago, I searched for any information about human colonies, any sign that others from Earth had survived. I found nothing, and I assumed I was alone. She turned to face the assembled academics. But what if I wasn't? What if humanity did establish colonies? But there's somewhere the Krell didn't want anyone to look. Somewhere they declared off-limits? The Thrixian historian's compound eyes began to whir as he processed this idea. The quarantine zones. Everyone turned to look at him. He continued, there are several regions of space designated as quarantine zones by the Galactic Council. Official records say they contain dangerous spatial anomalies or aggressive native species. Travel to these zones is strictly forbidden under Council law. And when were these zones established? Sarah asked. Though she already suspected the answer, the historian checked his records. The first quarantine zones were designated approximately 11,600 years ago, shortly after the Krell supposedly discovered Earth's destruction. Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in 3 centuries: hope. It was a fragile thing, dangerous even, but it burned in her chest like a small sun. I need to go to the quarantine zones. The Chancellor's gaseous form rippled with alarm. Dr. Chen, that's impossible. Council law strictly forbids. Council law that was written by the Krell, Sarah interrupted. Council law that was designed to keep people away from wherever humanity went. She looked around the room at the assembled academics. Don't you see? For 12,000 years, your civilization has believed humanity was extinct. But I'm here, alive, and if I survived, then maybe others did too. Maybe somewhere in those forbidden zones. Humanity has been building a civilization of its own. The Vulcarian professor's colors shifted to bright yellows. If you're correct, this would be the greatest archaeological discovery in galactic history. A lost civilization that isn't lost at all, merely hidden. Sarah smiled. And for the first time in 300 years, it was a genuine expression of joy. Then let's go find them. Let's go find my people. The Chancellor hesitated, clearly torn between academic curiosity and political caution. Even if we wanted to authorize such an expedition, the Council would never approve it. The quarantine zones are... I'm not asking for permission, Sarah said. I'm the last known human from old Earth. I'm a living piece of galactic history. And I'm telling you that I'm going to those zones whether you help me or not. The news of Sarah's existence spread through the galactic networks like wildfire, faster than any attempt at suppression could contain it. Within days, every major news service was broadcasting her story, the impossible human, the living fossil, the woman who proved that an entire species' extinction had been a lie. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and Sarah found herself standing before representatives of 247 species, all of them staring at her with expressions ranging from fascination to suspicion. She wore simple clothes, had refused any ceremonial dress, and spoke plainly when the council speaker recognized her honored representatives. Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. My name is Sarah Chun, and I am human. For 300 years I have lived among you, and for 300 years I believed I was the last of my kind. Now I have evidence suggesting that belief was wrong. She presented the findings her academic allies had compiled, the falsified records, the Krell documents, the suspicious timing of the quarantine zones. Some council members listened with open minds, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A Krell representative, a descendant of the species that had once ruled the galactic economy, stood to speak. These accusations against my ancestors are insulting and without merit. The Krell hegemony was a force for order and stability. To suggest they would engage in such elaborate deception is exactly what the evidence shows, Sarah interrupted. I'm not here to condemn the modern Krell people for the actions of their ancestors. I'm here to request authorization for an expedition to the quarantine zones to search for human survivors. The council chamber erupted into debate. Species who had long harbored resentments against the old Krell hegemony saw this as vindication. Others worried about the political implications of questioning historical records. Still others were simply fascinated by the possibility of discovering a hidden civilization after 3 days of debate. The council reached a compromise. They would authorize a single scientific expedition to investigate Sarah's claims. But it would be heavily monitored, and any violations of quarantine protocols would result in severe penalties. Sarah accepted these terms without hesitation. The research vessel Remembrance launched from Andromeda Prime 6 weeks later. Carrying Sarah, the Vulcarian professor, whose name was Crystal Reflects Starlight, a crew of 30 scientists and support staff from a dozen different species, and enough sensor equipment to scan an entire star system. Sarah stood on the bridge as they prepared for the jump to faster-than-light travel. Her hands gripping the console so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Coordinates locked for Sol System, the navigator announced. Original home system of species 347 Theta. Common name, humans. Estimated travel time, 6 days. 6 days. After 3 centuries of believing her homeworld was destroyed, Sarah would see Earth again in 6 days. She felt Crystal Reflects Starlight's gentle touch on her shoulder. The Vulcarian's crystalline hand warm against her skin. "Whatever we find," Crystal said softly, "you are not alone." The jump to FTL felt like stepping through a doorway into nothingness. Sarah had experienced it thousands of times, but this journey felt different. She was going home when they emerged from FTL 6 days later. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The view screen showed a star system that was intimately familiar from her childhood education. But with one crucial difference, it was intact. The sun burned steady and yellow. Not the dead cinder the historical records had described. Planets orbited in their proper positions, including a small blue world in the 3rd orbital position that made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. Sensor analysis confirms stellar stability. The ship's astrophysicist reported. No signs of catastrophic failure, past or present. This star is approximately 4.5 billion years old, with another 5 billion years of stable fusion remaining. Crystal Reflects Starlight's colors shifted to solemn blues. The Krell lied about everything as they approached Earth orbit. Long-range scans revealed something both heartening and heartbreaking. The planet was intact. The continents recognizable despite the passage of millennia. But there were no lights on the night side, no orbital structures, no radio signals, no signs of active civilization. Life signs are present, the xenobiologist reported. Plants, animals, complex ecosystems, but no technological signatures. It's as if someone removed all traces of civilization, but left the planet itself to heal. Sarah's throat was tight with emotion as she watched her homeworld grow larger on the view screen. "Take us down. I want to see it with my own eyes." They landed near what had once been Boston, where Sarah had spent 4 years of her life studying aerospace engineering and dreaming of the stars. The landing site was chosen because satellite imagery showed significant ruins in the area. Preserved structures that might hold clues. The airlock opened and Sarah stepped onto Earth's soil for the first time in over 3 centuries. She fell to her knees and pressed her hands into the dirt. She stayed like that for a long moment, reconnecting with her homeworld, before standing and looking around the ruins of Boston stretched before them. But something was wrong. Crystal Reflects Starlight noticed it too. These structures are too well preserved. Even with low weathering, 12,000 years should have caused more deterioration. The xenarchaeology team began their analysis while Sarah wandered through streets she half remembered. There was the library, where she had pulled all-nighters studying orbital mechanics. There was the coffee shop, where she had met her study group every Tuesday. There was the quad, where her graduation photo had been taken, but everything was wrong. It was like walking through a museum exhibit rather than genuine ruins. The buildings were empty but not destroyed, aged but not collapsed. And when the dating team completed their analysis, the reason became clear. These ruins are approximately 500 years old, the lead archaeologist announced. Not 12,000 years, 500. Sarah stared at the archaeologist in shock. That's impossible. The Krell records said. The Krell records lied. Crystal Reflects Starlight said gently. The question is, what happened 500 years ago, and where did humanity go? They found the answer in what had once been the Boston Public Library. The building had been carefully preserved, its contents protected from the elements by some kind of advanced environmental field that was still functioning after half a millennium inside. They found books, digital archives, personal effects, all arranged as if the library's occupants had intended someone to find them. And on a wall in the main reading room, carved in letters 6 inches high and repeated in dozens of languages, including English, was a message. We did not do, were not destroyed, we chose to leave if any human survives. If anyone comes looking, know this. Humanity departed Earth in the year 237 after first contact, went willingly into the unknown. Krell offered use chains. We chose freedom. Earth remains. Ace our monument, and our promise you will return. When we are ready, this is not an ending, it is a beginning. The last council of humanity. Sarah read the message 3 times, her hand shaking, tears streaming down her face. Crystal Reflects Starlight stood beside her, his crystalline body refracting the light into rainbow patterns that danced across the ancient words. They left, Sarah whispered. Humanity didn't die. They left Earth behind and went somewhere else. The implications crashed over her like a wave. The Genesis project had launched in 2048, 1 year after her graduation. If first contact had occurred around that same time, and humanity had departed 237 years later, that would place the exodus around the year 2285. Sarah had been lost in cryosleep, drifting through relativistic space while her species made the decision to leave Earth entirely. She had missed humanity's greatest journey by mere centuries. Where did they go? One of the other scientists asked. The message says they went into the unknown, but where? Crystal Reflects Starlight was already working on his datapad, pulling up star charts and historical records. If the Krell wanted to hide humanity's departure, they would need to declare certain regions of space off limits. The quarantine zones were established around the time humanity would have been leaving Earth. Sarah nodded slowly, her mind racing. They went to the quarantine zones. Humanity looked at the galactic map, found the places no one was allowed to go, and decided those were exactly where they wanted to be. She laughed, and it was a sound of pure joy mixed with despair. That's so perfectly human. Tell us we can't go somewhere, and that's exactly where we'll go. The team spent 3 more days on Earth, documenting everything they found. They discovered more messages, more clues, more evidence of humanity's deliberate departure. The picture that emerged was of a species that had been offered a place in the galactic community, but only under terms. They found unacceptable. Humanity had refused to become economic vassals to the Krell hegemony. Instead, they had spent 2 centuries building a fleet in secret, pooling every resource Earth had, and planning an exodus to unexplored space where they could develop on their own terms. The Krell, unable to tolerate this defiance, had decided to make humanity's departure look like extinction, a cautionary tale to prevent other species from following their example. Sarah stood at the boarding ramp of the Remembrance on their last day. The return journey to Andromeda Prime took longer than the outbound trip because Sarah insisted on stopping at several abandoned human facilities scattered throughout the inner galaxy. Each site told the same story: careful preservation, deliberate abandonment, and messages left for anyone who might come looking at a research station on Mars. They found a complete archive of human history up to the year 285 after first contact. At a small colony on Europa, they discovered engineering schematics for the Exodus fleet. At an automated beacon orbiting Jupiter, they recovered the actual coordinates where humanity had gone. Crystal reflects starlight studied the coordinates with growing amazement. This region is designated as Quarantine Zone 7. It's supposedly filled with unstable wormholes and aggressive native species. No one has been permitted to enter for over 11,000 years. Sarah smiled grimly, which means that's exactly where we need to go. When they returned to Andromeda Prime, Sarah found herself at the center of a political firestorm. Her discoveries on Earth had vindicated her claims, but they had also raised uncomfortable questions about how deeply the Krell manipulation had penetrated galactic institutions. The Galactic Council was in chaos. Representatives demanded investigations into historical records. Academic institutions scrambled to revise their curricula, and conspiracy theories spread faster than any official statements could counteract them. Through it all, Sarah remained focused on a single goal: getting permission to enter Quarantine Zone 7. The council will never approve it, a sympathetic administrator told her. Too many species have vested interests in maintaining the current restrictions. Some genuinely believe the zones are dangerous. Others worry about what opening them might mean politically. Sarah's response was simple: then I'll go without permission. Crystal reflects Starlight, who had become her closest ally and friend during the expedition, was less diplomatic. Sarah, if you violate quarantine protocols, the council could arrest you, impound any ship you use, and effectively end your search. We need to be strategic about this. But Sarah had lived for 3 centuries, and she was tired of being strategic. I'd been patient my whole life. I waited decades for the Genesis project to be approved. I waited centuries thinking I was alone. I'm not waiting anymore. She began reaching out to sympathetic allies, academics who had been inspired by her discoveries, politicians who saw opportunity in challenging the old order, scientists who were simply curious about what 12,000 years of isolated human development might have produced. One of those allies was a Threnian named Whisper of Equations, the same astrophysicist who had first proven the falsification of Earth's stellar death. Whisper approached Sarah with a proposal. I have access to a long-range exploration vessel, the gaseous Threnian Harmonized. Officially, it's being used for dark matter research in deep space. Unofficially, dark matter research can take us anywhere we want to go. Sarah felt hope kindle in her chest. You would risk your career to help me? Whisper's form rippled with what Sarah had learned was Threnian laughter. Dr. Chun, you are the living proof that everything we thought we knew about an entire species was wrong. Helping you find the rest of humanity is worth any risk. Within 2 months, Sarah had assembled an expedition team. Crystal reflects Starlight and his Zen archaeology department, Whisper of Equations, and a crew of astrophysicists, several xenobiologists who were fascinated by human evolution, and a handful of security personnel who were loyal enough or curious enough to ignore potential council sanctions. The ship they used was called the Deep Explorer, a Threnian vessel designed for extended missions in unmapped space. Sarah stood on its bridge as they prepared to depart, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of solitude finally beginning to lift. Course plotted for Quarantine Zone 7, the navigator announced. Estimated travel time: 3 weeks. 3 weeks to find her people. 3 weeks to end her lonely exile. 3 weeks to discover what humanity had become. The journey was tense. They traveled along rarely used trade routes to avoid council patrols, jumped through unmonitored sectors, and used every trick whisper of equations knew to hide their destination. Sarah spent most of the journey studying the recovered human archives, trying to understand the civilization that had left Earth. What she found both thrilled and terrified her. Humanity in the centuries after first contact had been driven by a singular purpose: to build a civilization that could stand independent of galactic power structures. They had rejected cruel economic models, developed new technologies based on principles the rest of the galaxy hadn't considered, and created a social system that prioritized both individual freedom and collective strength. They were preparing for something, Sarah told Crystal Reflect Starlight one evening as they reviewed the archives together. Not just leaving Earth, but building something new. Something that could compete with the established galactic powers. Crystal's colors shifted to thoughtful yellows. The Krell must have been terrified. Here was a species barely a century into space travel, already threatening to upend the entire galactic order when they finally reached the boundary of Quarantine Zone 7. Sarah felt her heart begin to race. The sensor arrays showed nothing unusual, no unstable wormholes, no aggressive species. Just normal space filled with stars and planets, and the vast emptiness between. The quarantine warnings were completely fabricated. Whisper of equations reported. This region is perfectly safe for travel. In fact, it's remarkably stable, ideal for colonization. They crossed the boundary, and immediately the ship's sensors began picking up something unexpected. Organized radio signals, power signatures, traces of faster-than-light drives. All the hallmarks of an advanced technological civilization. Multiple inhabited star systems detected. The sensor officer reported, his voice shaking with excitement. Hundreds of them. Artificial structures in orbit around dozens of planets. This entire region is colonized. Sarah gripped the edge of the console, afraid to believe what the sensors were telling her. Can you identify the species? The sensor officer worked frantically, comparing the signals against the galactic database. Negative. These signatures don't match any known species. But wait, I'm picking up language patterns in the radio signals. Running translation algorithms now. The bridge fell silent as they waited. Then the translation AI spoke in a flat, mechanical voice. Language identified. Earth English. Variant evolution. Confidence. 97%. Sarah's knees went weak and Crystal Reflects Starlight caught her before she fell. Tears streamed down her face as she laughed and sobbed simultaneously. They're here. They're really here. The ship's long-range scanners began mapping the region, and what they found was staggering. Humanity had colonized over 300 star systems, built massive orbital habitats, terraformed dozens of worlds, and created a civilization that rivaled any of the galactic powers. This is impossible, one of the xenobiologists whispered. No species has ever achieved this level of development in isolation. It takes millennia of cultural exchange, technology sharing, integrated supply chains. Unless you're human, Sarah said, her voice filled with pride she hadn't felt in centuries. Unless you're a species that thrives on challenges and refuses to accept limitations. They were preparing to move deeper into human-controlled space when the ship's proximity alarms began to wail. 3 vessels emerged from FTL, travel around them, surrounding the Deep Explorer with practiced precision. The ships were beautiful, sleek designs that blended aesthetic elegance with obvious military capability. They were clearly human-made, evolved from the engineering principles Sarah had learned at MIT, but refined by 12 millennia of development. Communication signal came through, transmitted in dozens of galactic languages before finally settling on English. Unidentified vessel. You have entered sovereign territory of the Terran Commonwealth. State your purpose and prepare for diplomatic processing. Be advised that unauthorized entry into Commonwealth space is a serious violation of interstellar law. Sarah's hand shook as she activated the communication panel. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and spoke in English, her native tongue, unused for decades. This is Dr. Sarah Chun, formerly of Earth, citizen of the United States, Massachusetts Institute of Technology class of 2047. I'm coming home. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the communication channel crackled to life again, and this time, the voice on the other end was charged with emotion. Sarah Chun? As in Genesis Project Sarah Chun? The Lost Expedition? Stand by, this is Commonwealth Naval Vessel Endeavour. We're transmitting priority diplomatic codes to the Council of Admirals. Dr. Chen, if you're who you claim to be, we've been looking for you for 12,000 years. Sarah couldn't speak. She could only nod while tears streamed down her face and crystal reflects starlight's colors, cycled through every shade of joy in the Valkyrian spectrum. Welcome home. Dr. Chun, the voice from the Commonwealth ship said. Welcome to the Terran Commonwealth. Humanity has been waiting for you. The Commonwealth naval vessel Endeavour was larger than any ship Sarah had ever seen, dwarfing even the massive trading vessels that plied the major galactic routes. When the shuttle from the Deep Explorer approached its docking bay, Sarah pressed her face against the viewport like a child, drinking in every detail of human engineering. The docking bay was filled with activity, human activity, and Sarah felt something break open in her chest that had been locked tight for 3 centuries. There were people, actual humans, walking and working and living. They were taller than she remembered, clearly benefiting from genetic enhancements that had been only theoretical in her time. But they were unmistakably human when the shuttle's airlock opened. Sarah stepped out onto a human ship for the first time since the Genesis Project. And a woman in a crisp military uniform stepped forward to greet her. The woman's eyes were bright with tears as she saluted. Dr. Chun, I'm Commander Lisa Park of the Commonwealth Navy. On behalf of all humanity, welcome home. Sarah tried to return the salute, but her hands were shaking too badly. Commander Park immediately abandoned protocol and pulled Sarah into a hug. And Sarah clung to her and sobbed like she hadn't allowed herself to sob in 300 years. We thought you were lost, Park whispered. All of you, the entire Genesis Project, we've been searching for any sign, any trace, for 12,000 years. Every deep space expedition has standing orders to look for debris, beacons, anything. And here you are, alive. When Sarah finally pulled back and wiped her eyes, she looked around the docking bay at the assembled crew members, all of them watching her with expressions of wonder. I'm sorry I took so long to get here. Park laughed through her own tears. You're here now. That's what matters. Sarah and her companions were taken to what Park called the Admiralty Conference Room, a space that managed to be both functionally military and elegantly designed. There, they met Admiral Marcus Webb, a man whose genetic enhancements were subtle, but whose bearing spoke of generations of military tradition. Dr. Chun, Admiral Webb said, his voice formal but warm. You cannot imagine what your survival means to us. The Genesis Project holds a special place in our history and our hearts. Every child in the Commonwealth learns about the 10,000 who were lost, the brave pioneers who set out to find humanity a home among the stars. Sarah felt another wave of emotion. They did find us a home. All 9,999 of them died, but they brought me here, to you. That has to count for something. Admiral Webb nodded solemnly. It counts for everything. But now I need to ask you some questions. Your ship transmitted identification codes that match pre-Exodus Earth protocols. You travel with non-human companions. And you speak as if you've been living in the wider galaxy. We need to understand your story. Sarah told them everything. The Genesis Project's launch, the navigation failure that threw them thousands of years into the future, waking up alone on a dead ship being rescued by Vulcarians, learning that Earth was supposedly destroyed and humanity extinct. The 3 centuries she spent moving through galactic society. And finally, her accidental revelation in a university lecture. How crystal reflects starlight added context about the Krull conspiracy, the falsified records, the discovery on Earth, and their journey to the quarantine zones. Admiral Webb listened intently, his expression growing darker as the story progressed. "So the galaxy believes we're extinct," Webb said when they finished. "And this Krull hegemony, though apparently no longer a major power, orchestrated a conspiracy to hide our exodus." "That's correct," Sarah confirmed. "But now that I've revealed myself, now that we've found you, the secret is out. The galaxy knows humanity survived, and they know we're somewhere in the quarantine zones." Admiral Webb exchanged glances with the other officers present. "This changes everything. For 12,000 years, we've maintained isolation by choice. We've built our civilization, developed our technologies, created our culture, all without external interference. We always planned to eventually reintroduce ourselves to the galaxy, but on our terms, when we were ready. And are you ready?" Sarah asked. Admiral Webb smiled. "That's a question for people much more important than me. I'm going to take you to New Olympus, our capital world. The Commonwealth Assembly will want to meet you, and they'll have to decide what happens next." The journey to New Olympus took 3 days, and Sarah spent that time learning about what humanity had become. The Commonwealth was a federation of over 300 colonized systems, with a population exceeding 200 billion humans. They had developed technologies that made them competitive with, and in some cases, superior to the established galactic powers. Commander Park gave Sarah a tour of the Endeavor, and every new revelation made Sarah's heart swell with pride. They had gravity manipulation that was more efficient than any galactic standard, medical technology that had extended human lifespans to 500 years on average, environmental systems that could terraform hostile worlds in decades rather than centuries, and most impressively, a faster-than-light drive based on principles the rest of the galaxy hadn't even theorized. "How did you develop all this in isolation?" Sarah asked. "The xenobiologist on my expedition said it should be impossible for a species to advance this far without cultural and technological exchange." Park smiled. "That's because they're thinking like established galactic species, conservative, risk-averse, comfortable with incremental progress. Humans don't think that way. We never have. Our ancestors came to the quarantine zones, determined to prove that humanity could thrive without Krull economic control. And they poured everything into research and development." She gestured around the ship. "Every generation pushed further. We didn't have the luxury of complacency, because we knew that someday we'd have to stand as equals with civilizations that had millions of years of development. So we innovated, we took risks, we failed and tried again. That's the human way." When they finally arrived at New Olympus, Sarah stood at the viewport and stared at the world below. It was beautiful, a terraformed planet with blue oceans, green continents, and cities that glowed like jewels across the night side. In orbit, massive habitats housed billions more humans, and the space lanes were thick with traffic. "Welcome to the heart of the Terran Commonwealth," Park said softly. "Welcome to what humanity built." Sarah was taken to the Commonwealth Assembly, a building that managed to evoke both the architecture of old Earth and something entirely new. She walked into the chamber where representatives from all 300 systems had gathered, and every eye turned toward her. The First Minister, a woman named Amara Okonkwo, stepped forward to greet Sarah personally. She was tall and elegant, with enhancements that made her eyes shimmer with gold flecks, but her smile was warm and genuine. "Dr. Chen, you honor us with your presence. You're a living bridge between old Earth and the Commonwealth we've built." Sarah found herself at a loss for words, but First Minister Okonkwo continued, "I'm sure you have questions." We certainly have questions for you. But first, there's something you should see. Okonkwo led Sarah to a memorial chamber within the assembly building. There, carved into walls of polished stone, were 247 names, every member of the Genesis project crew except one. Sarah Chun's name was listed separately, on a plaque that read, "Lost, but not forgotten. May she find her way home." "We never gave up hope," Okonkwo said quietly. "Every deep space mission for 12,000 years has carried instructions to search for any trace of the Genesis project. And now, impossibly, you're here." Sarah ran her fingers over the names of her fellow crew members. People she had known and laughed with and dreamed with. They deserved to be remembered. They died trying to save humanity. They did save humanity, Okonkwo corrected gently. Without the Genesis project's sacrifice, without the example of humans willing to risk everything for the future, our ancestors might not have had the courage to attempt the Exodus. Your mission inspired a civilization, Dr. Chun. Over the following days, Sarah met with the Commonwealth Assembly and told them everything about the state of the galaxy, the political structures, the economic systems, the hundreds of species that made up the galactic community. In turn, they explained to her what humanity had become. The Terran Commonwealth was powerful, technologically advanced, and determined to maintain its independence. But they were also cautious, knowing that premature revelation could lead to conflict with species who might fear a rival power. They had always planned to eventually announce their presence, but they wanted to do so from a position of absolute strength. The question now, First Minister Okonkwo said during a private meeting with Sarah, is whether we're ready. Your discovery has accelerated our timeline. The galaxy knows we exist. They know we're in the quarantine zones. We can either continue to hide, which becomes more difficult every day, or we can step forward and reclaim our place in the galactic community. Sarah looked at the First Minister. What do you want me to do? Okonkwo smiled. I want you to be our ambassador. You've lived in both worlds, old Earth and the wider galaxy. You understand galactic politics in ways we never could. More importantly, you're living proof that humanity endures. When we reveal ourselves, I want you to stand at our side.